Recently, a video shared by the hacking group Anonymous stirred controversy across social media and news outlets. The video features clips of the late Prince Philip, along with other prominent figures, commenting on the issue of human overpopulation. In these clips, they express concerns that the Earth may not be able to sustain the growing human population in the long term due to the limited availability of environmental resources. The resurfacing of these comments has reignited passionate debates about overpopulation, environmental sustainability, and social equity.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population. Because if where we are, there's nothing else.
And do you have views about what should be done about that?
Can't you guess?
Or epidemics. I mean, I don't know what it will be. But in one way or another, we are so far, globally, we are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that.
In 1988, Prince Philip made a controversial statement during an interview with Deutsche Presseagentur, expressing a desire to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to address overpopulation. This remark resurfaced following his death in 2021, sparking renewed debates about population control and environmental sustainability. The quote, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation," was widely criticized for its insensitivity and perceived endorsement of drastic measures to curb human population growth. Critics argue that such statements reflect a disconnect between the privileged elite and the broader populace, particularly those in developing nations who often bear the brunt of environmental policies without having a significant voice in their formulation. Human overpopulation has long been a topic of discussion among scientists, policymakers, and activists. It typically refers to the condition where the number of people exceeds the capacity of the environment to provide life-sustaining resources such as food, clean water, and shelter. Although this concern is often discussed at the global level, it is also relevant to individual nations, regions, and cities where resource management is already strained. The arguments made in the video align with these worries, suggesting that unless action is taken, humanity could face severe consequences such as mass starvation, water shortages, and widespread environmental collapse. However, the fact that it was figures like Prince Philip and other wealthy individuals making these statements has fueled significant outrage. Many people feel that the conversation around overpopulation often seems to come from those who are least affected by scarcity. Wealthy elites typically have the resources to shield themselves from the harsh realities of environmental degradation, while the poorer majority experiences these struggles firsthand. Consequently, critics argue that the narrative of overpopulation is being weaponized to push policies that disproportionately affect the less privileged, all while protecting the status quo for those in power. This controversy reveals a broader social tension. It highlights the feeling among many that when discussions about global issues arise, especially ones that could lead to major policy changes, the voices of ordinary and disadvantaged people are often excluded. Instead, the conversation is dominated by a few individuals or groups who already hold wealth, influence, and power. Many fear that instead of finding fair and inclusive solutions to environmental problems, strategies will be crafted in ways that preserve privilege for the few and impose restrictions and hardships on the many. Moreover, critics point out that focusing purely on population numbers oversimplifies a complex problem. They argue that consumption patterns, not sheer numbers, are the primary drivers of environmental degradation. It is well documented that wealthier individuals and nations consume vastly more resources per capita than poorer ones. Thus, blaming overpopulation without addressing inequality and overconsumption risks, perpetuating an unfair and misleading narrative. The anonymous video featuring Prince Philip and others has triggered important conversations about the realities of overpopulation and the dangers of allowing only the wealthy to define these narratives. For decades, some experts have warned of impending resource shortages, environmental collapse, and mass suffering due to unchecked population growth. However, an equally strong and growing counterargument has emerged, asserting that the overpopulation narrative is less about inevitable catastrophe and more about maintaining certain power structures. Critics argue that the overpopulation scare often benefits powerful corporations and institutions, serving their interests while masking deeper issues of inequality, resource mismanagement, and systemic greed. At the heart of the counter-argument is the assertion that Earth's resources, if distributed fairly and managed sustainably, could easily support the current and even a larger population. Critics highlight that the world's resource distribution is grossly unequal. Wealthy nations and large multinational corporations hold disproportionate control over critical supplies such as food, water, and energy. Meanwhile, billions live in poverty and scarcity, not because the Earth cannot provide for them, but because the systems of governance and commerce prioritize profit over equitable access. This perspective challenges the simplistic framing of overpopulation as a numerical problem. It invites a closer examination of political, economic, and social systems that create and sustain artificial scarcity while protecting privilege for the few. Historically, the overpopulation narrative has not been a neutral concern for human welfare. It has been weaponized to justify a range of harmful policies and actions. Throughout the 20th century, governments around the world used fears of overpopulation to enforce brutal measures, such as forced sterilizations, particularly targeting marginalized and minority communities. Immigration policies, too, have often been justified on the grounds of protecting resources from being overwhelmed by outsiders, thus cloaking xenophobia and economic exploitation in the language of sustainability. These historical precedents reveal a dark underside to the rhetoric of overpopulation, one that many argue continues into the present day. Today, the same narrative can be found subtly shaping public opinion and policy. Appeals to overpopulation fears are often used to normalize lower living standards, tighter social surveillance, and the acceptance of increasingly precarious working conditions. All of this is done under the noble-sounding banner of saving the planet. The real irony, however, is that while ordinary people are encouraged to sacrifice more, large corporations continue their environmentally destructive practices largely unchecked. Industries responsible for massive carbon emissions, deforestation, water pollution, and waste production are rarely held to account with the same urgency demanded of individual consumers. Thus, the overpopulation scare becomes a convenient diversion, redirecting attention and blame away from corporate malfeasance and systemic inefficiencies. The critics further argue that technological progress offers a clear rebuttal to overpopulation alarmism. Innovations in agriculture, renewable energy, water purification, and urban planning have shown that human societies are not static and incapable of adaptation. Advances such as vertical farming, solar and wind energy, desalination, and smart city design demonstrate that the planet's carrying capacity is not fixed. With creativity, investment, and cooperation, humanity has the tools to sustain growing populations while reducing environmental impact. The real obstacle lies not in population numbers, but in the resistance of entrenched interests to adopt and support sustainable, equitable technologies that do not directly serve their financial bottom line. Another important aspect of this debate concerns the psychology of fear. Fear is a powerful motivator, and the threat of a planet choked by billions of desperate, starving people is a compelling narrative for those seeking to implement controversial policies or sell expensive solutions. By cultivating a sense of inevitability and helplessness, powerful actors can guide public behavior in ways that preserve and enhance their control. Scarcity, whether real or perceived, becomes a tool for social engineering. Under such conditions, it is easier to convince populations to accept reduced freedoms, heightened surveillance, and increased economic disparities as necessary sacrifices. Many critics also highlight the ethical problems inherent in framing human beings as the problem. Such narratives risk dehumanizing large segments of the global population, particularly those living in poverty. Instead of viewing them as fellow participants in a shared human endeavor, they become framed as burdens or threats to the well-being of more privileged groups. This dangerous framing can deepen global inequalities and erode the sense of solidarity necessary for genuine, compassionate problem-solving on issues like climate change, food security, and sustainable development. Moreover, overpopulation rhetoric often ignores the nuanced differences between consumption levels across different populations. It is well documented that the wealthiest nations, despite often having lower birth rates, consume vastly more resources per capita than poorer, more populous nations. A single wealthy individual's carbon footprint can easily surpass that of dozens or even hundreds of people living in less developed areas. Therefore, focusing solely on the number of people misses the more critical issue: how resources are consumed and by whom. This framing protects high-consumption lifestyles and industries from necessary scrutiny and reform. In addition, critics argue that demographic trends are already moving towards stabilization without the need for drastic interventions. In many parts of the world, especially in wealthier nations, birth rates have declined significantly, sometimes even below replacement levels. It is also worth noting that human ingenuity thrives under challenge. The history of civilization is filled with examples of societies that adapted creatively to population pressures by developing new technologies, social structures, and cultural innovations. Rather than viewing human beings as a drain on resources, an alternative view sees them as the greatest resource of all. Every person represents a potential contributor to the collective problem-solving capacity of humanity. The true task, then, is not to limit the number of contributors, but to empower them through education, opportunity, and inclusion. As of right now, while it is undeniable that population growth presents real challenges, the narrative of overpopulation as an existential threat is deeply flawed and often serves hidden agendas. It shifts blame away from systems of inequality, irresponsible consumption, and environmental mismanagement, placing it instead on the shoulders of ordinary people, especially the poor and marginalized. The Earth is capable of supporting human life in abundance if managed wisely and fairly. Rather than succumbing to fear and division, society should focus its energies on dismantling inequitable systems, promoting sustainable technologies, and building inclusive institutions that recognize and empower the full potential of the global population. Only by addressing the true roots of resource scarcity and environmental degradation can humanity create a future that is both just and sustainable for all.